It was a warm afternoon in the city, the kind of day when the sun shone brightly and people moved about in a hurry, lost in their own routines. The streets were busy, filled with the usual mix of office workers, students, and pedestrians trying to get somewhere on time. The city had its usual hum, the honking of cars, the chatter of people walking past one another, the faint smell of street food mixed with exhaust fumes. Among all these ordinary people, one man walked with calm confidence, holding himself in a way that immediately made him stand out. He was neatly dressed, wearing a suit that fit him perfectly, and his steps were measured, deliberate. He was heading to a meeting that would decide part of the city's future. But at that moment, he was simply another person navigating the crowd. On the same street, a police officer patrolled, his uniform crisp, his badge glinting in the sunlight. He was a man who liked to feel in control, someone who had spent years believing that authority meant unquestioned power. That afternoon, something about the man walking down the street caught his eye. Perhaps it was the calm way he carried himself. Perhaps it was the color of his skin, or maybe it was nothing at all, just a flimsy suspicion that grew in his mind. Whatever it was, it sparked an idea that would lead to a moment no one would forget. The officer called out abruptly, making the man stop. "Hey you," he barked. His voice was harsh, more a command than a question. The man turned his head slightly, surprised by the tone but keeping his composure. "Yes?" he said calmly, his voice steady, polite, but firm. The officer stepped closer, his face tense. "What are you doing here? You look suspicious." His words were heavy, loaded with judgment. He didn't wait for an answer. Without warning, he pushed the man slightly, as if he could assert control just by physical force. The man stumbled back, more surprised than hurt, and raised his hands in a gesture that said he meant no harm. "I haven't done anything wrong," he said evenly, his eyes meeting the officer's without fear. He wanted to de-escalate, to show that he wasn't a threat, but the officer's anger seemed to grow and reason didn't seem to matter anymore. "Don't argue with me," the officer snapped. Then in a shocking instant he threw a punch. The man was hit hard in the shoulder, stumbling forward. People on the street froze for a moment, their eyes widening in disbelief. Some gasped. Others instinctively reached for their phones to record what was happening. The street that had been alive with ordinary movement suddenly fell into a tense stillness, every passerby becoming a witness to an act that should never have happened. The man caught himself, barely losing balance. He straightened up, took a deep breath, and looked directly at the officer. There was no anger in his expression, only calm, a quiet confidence that seemed almost impossible given what had just occurred. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying a weight of authority. His words weren't meant to provoke. They were meant to challenge the injustice of the moment. Bystanders began murmuring among themselves. Some shouted at the officer, telling him to stop, questioning his actions. One young woman stepped closer, holding her phone out. "This is being recorded," she called, her voice trembling but determined. Others joined in, their voices growing louder, forming a chorus of disbelief and anger. The officer looked around, suddenly aware that everyone was watching, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. The man didn't move aggressively. He didn't shout or retaliate. Instead, he stood tall, calmly holding his ground. He looked around at the witnesses, then back at the officer and said simply, "I am not the person you think I am. You've made a mistake." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Mistake? You think I'm wrong? You could have been—" He stopped mid-sentence, his words fading as confusion replaced his initial anger. Something about the man's demeanor, the calm authority in his posture, made the officer hesitate. He felt a strange, sudden doubt creeping in. The man, sensing the hesitation, spoke again, his voice steady, commanding attention without shouting. "I am the mayor of this city." The words hung in the air like a sudden thunderclap. The bystanders froze. Phones paused mid-recording. The officer's eyes widened, and for a split second his face went pale. The punch he had thrown, the aggression he had shown, all seemed meaningless now. He looked at the man standing before him, the same man who had been calm and unassuming just moments ago, and realized that he had struck someone far more powerful and respected than himself. A murmur spread through the crowd. "The mayor?" someone whispered. Others repeated it, their voices carrying the shock like wildfire. The officer looked around, hoping for some kind of explanation, some way to recover, but there was none. Every eye was on him and every face showed disbelief and condemnation. The man adjusted his suit slightly, brushing off the encounter with quiet dignity. He didn't yell. He didn't show anger. He simply stood there, holding himself with the same poise he had maintained throughout his life. "I understand mistakes happen," he said softly, "but I expect accountability." The officer, now fully aware of his error, took a step back. His hand trembled slightly and his voice was uncertain. I didn't know," he began, but his words fell flat in the face of the public's scrutiny. He realized that nothing he said now could erase what had just happened. People on the street started talking among themselves, sharing their reactions, expressing outrage, but also admiration for the mayor's calmness. Some people who had been walking past stopped to witness the scene fully, drawn in by the tension and the unfolding drama. The man's calmness contrasted sharply with the officer's panic, highlighting the injustice of the punch and the absurdity of the situation. As the crowd grew, the man took a careful step back, giving the officer space, but also signaling that he expected him to remain in place until the matter was addressed. He didn't shout or push. He simply let his presence speak volumes. Witnesses began to record everything more attentively, knowing that what they were seeing would likely go beyond a local story. It was a moment that carried lessons about power, respect, and humanity. The officer fumbled for words, trying to explain himself, trying to justify what he had done, but every attempt sounded hollow. The mayor's gaze never wavered, calm yet firm, showing that he would not be intimidated even in the face of violence. Around them, the ordinary hum of the city seemed distant, replaced by the heavy tension of the moment. As everyone realized the weight of what had just happened, people in the crowd whispered about what would happen next. "Will he be arrested?" one asked. "Is the mayor okay?" another wondered. The man himself didn't react outwardly. He simply maintained his composure, showing that dignity was not lost even when faced with an unprovoked attack. His calmness seemed to give the crowd courage, reminding them that injustice could be faced with poise rather than rage. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer lowered his head, fully aware of the seriousness of his actions. His hand shook slightly as he adjusted his uniform, as if trying to regain some semblance of control. The mayor, still composed, spoke once more. "Mistakes have consequences," he said, his voice carrying authority without anger. "This is a moment for accountability, not excuses." The people around them nodded silently, many taking deep breaths as they processed what had just occurred. It wasn't just a story about a punch or an angry officer. It was about the sudden shock of seeing someone abused for no reason, and then witnessing the power of calm dignity in response to injustice. It was about how ordinary life could suddenly change in a heartbeat, and how courage could manifest not just through confrontation, but through the way someone carried themselves even after being wronged. By the time the mayor walked away, the crowd had dispersed slightly, but the impact lingered. Phones continued to record and whispers continued to spread through the streets. People would tell their friends, their families, and strangers about the moment they had witnessed. A man struck without cause, yet remaining calm, revealing his true identity, and demanding accountability with grace. And the officer? He remained there frozen, knowing that this mistake would follow him for a long time. He understood now that authority without respect could crumble in an instant, and that actions born from prejudice could never be justified, especially when confronted by the truth and the unwavering dignity of another human being. The city had witnessed an incident that would ripple far beyond that single street, a reminder that every interaction mattered, that power had limits, and that the true measure of a person often came not in moments of comfort, but in moments of challenge and confrontation. And so, the day continued, the sun shining on the busy streets, but now with a story etched into its rhythm, one of injustice, realization, dignity, and the quiet power of standing tall in the face of wrongdoing. After the shocking incident on the street, the city seemed to hum again, but there was a noticeable tension lingering in the air. People who had witnessed what happened couldn't stop talking about it. Some were still standing near the street corner, pointing their phones at the pavement, replaying the video they had captured. Others whispered in small groups, discussing the boldness of the mayor and the shocking behavior of the officer. Everyone seemed to agree on one thing: what had just happened was far from ordinary. The mayor, having regained his composure, walked steadily toward his car. Despite the punch he had received, He moved with calm determination, his mind already thinking several steps ahead. He had a meeting to attend, responsibilities that demanded his attention, but the street incident weighed on him. It wasn't just about the attack, it was about what it represented. Racism and abuse of power were realities he had faced before, but confronting them head-on, especially in public, always carried a certain heaviness. Yet he refused to let fear or anger dictate his response. Inside the car, the mayor took a moment to breathe deeply. He closed his eyes briefly, feeling the sharp sting in his shoulder where the officer had hit him. It wasn't unbearable, but it was a reminder that physical force could reach even the most careful and prepared individuals. He thought about the officer's face, the sudden shock and panic when he realized who he had struck. That moment would stay with him for a long time, and he knew it would be discussed, dissected, and shared widely across the city. Meanwhile, the officer stood frozen on the street, uncertain of what to do next. People continued to gather around, their curiosity and concern mixing with outrage. Some were trying to calm the situation, telling the officer to step aside and let the mayor go. Others were more vocal, yelling at him, calling for immediate action, and questioning his conduct. His colleagues had not yet arrived, and he felt exposed, caught between the crowd's anger and his own shame. Finally, backup arrived. 2 other officers approached cautiously, their expressions unreadable. They quickly assessed the situation, glancing at the mayor and then at their colleague. The officer who had thrown the punch looked down at the ground, unable to meet anyone's eyes. He knew that his actions had consequences far beyond what he had imagined. His training hadn't prepared him for this. The sudden exposure of a mistake made public. The realization that he had struck someone he should have respected. The mayor spoke to the arriving officers calmly but firmly. "Please ensure that the situation is handled correctly," he said. "I want accountability, but I also want peace for the people here." His words were measured yet carried authority. The officers nodded, realizing that the man they were speaking to was not just any citizen. He was the city's leader, and he expected both professionalism and justice. As the mayor prepared to leave for his meeting, bystanders continued to gather, forming small clusters on the sidewalks. Some approached him cautiously, expressing concern for his safety. "Are you okay?" one woman asked softly. "I'm fine," he replied, giving a reassuring smile. "Thank you for your concern. I appreciate you standing here and witnessing the truth." His gratitude wasn't just polite, it carried a recognition that ordinary citizens were now part of a larger story, one where their attention and voices mattered. Social media began to buzz immediately. Videos from different angles surfaced, each showing the punch, the crowd's reaction, and the mayor's calm response. Comments flooded in, ranging from anger toward the officer to admiration for the mayor's composure. The incident quickly became a trending topic in the city, sparking conversations not only about individual behavior, but also about systemic issues. People discussed racism, misuse of authority, and the importance of accountability in positions of power. Back at City Hall, the mayor entered his office, greeted briefly by his staff who had already heard news of the incident. He waved them off politely, signaling that he would handle the situation personally but needed a moment to prepare for his meeting. Sitting at his desk, he allowed himself a small moment to reflect. It wasn't easy to be physically attacked in public, especially in front of citizens, but he understood that the focus needed to be on the larger implications. The incident was a symptom of deeper issues, and addressing it properly could lead to meaningful change. The mayor's assistant entered cautiously, holding a folder of documents. "Sir, people are calling the station. The press is already on their way. How do you want to handle this?" she asked. The mayor leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "We will issue a statement," he said, "but it will be measured, clear, and focused on accountability and learning. We will not escalate the situation with anger, but we will not downplay it either. People need to see leadership in action." Meanwhile, the officer was escorted to a quiet room at the precinct for questioning. His hand still shook slightly and he avoided eye contact with anyone. He recounted the events, struggling to explain his actions without seeming dismissive of their gravity. Superiors asked detailed questions, reviewing video footage and statements from witnesses. Every detail mattered, and the officer realized that this was not a simple reprimand. It could define his career, his reputation, and his personal understanding of justice. In the city, Conversations about the incident continued to grow. Community leaders began organizing meetings to discuss public safety, racial equity, and policing practices. Ordinary citizens shared their opinions in local forums, emphasizing that incidents like this could not be ignored. Even those who had never interacted with the mayor personally felt a connection through the event. They had witnessed dignity in the face of aggression and realized the importance of speaking up against wrongdoing. The mayor, aware of the attention, made a decision to engage directly with both the community and the police department. He scheduled a meeting with the department's leadership, not to punish blindly, but to ensure that lessons were learned. His approach emphasized reform and understanding, while making it clear that accountability was non-negotiable. He understood that leadership required both empathy and firmness, and he aimed to demonstrate that even under provocation, a leader could remain composed and focused on justice. As evening approached, the city streets began to return to their normal rhythm, but the incident remained on everyone's minds. Store owners closed their shops, students walked home, and commuters caught buses, but their conversations lingered on the events of the afternoon. The story had become a part of the city's daily narrative, a reminder that even ordinary days could be interrupted by extraordinary events. The mayor, after his meetings and phone calls, returned home for a brief moment of solitude. He reflected on how quickly situations could escalate when judgment was clouded by prejudice or fear. He thought about the officer, recognizing that human mistakes were part of life, but that systems needed to prevent such mistakes from causing harm. He considered the bystanders and the citizens who had recorded the event. They had captured a truth that could not be ignored. That night, the mayor drafted a public statement, emphasizing calm, dignity, and accountability. He highlighted the importance of community engagement, fairness in law enforcement, and the responsibility of leaders at every level. His words were simple, clear, and human. He wanted people to understand that this was not just about one officer or one punch. It was about creating a culture where respect, understanding, and justice were prioritized in every interaction. By the next morning, the incident had already spread far beyond the city. News outlets reported it, and discussions erupted on social media platforms. People debated, shared opinions, and reflected on their own experiences. Some expressed outrage at the officer's actions, others praised the mayor's calm demeanor, and many called for systemic changes to prevent similar situations in the future. The city had been shaken, but it was also beginning a conversation that might lead to meaningful progress. The mayor prepared for a series of meetings with community leaders, law enforcement officials, and civil rights advocates. He aimed to ensure that the story would not be forgotten, but also that it would inspire thoughtful reflection and action. He spoke to reporters with measured words, conveying the seriousness of the incident while maintaining a tone of hope. "This is a moment to reflect on our responsibilities," he said. "It is a reminder that every action matters, and that respect and justice must guide how we treat each other." In the officer's office, the reality of the situation weighed heavily. He knew that his career could be affected permanently, but more importantly, he understood the broader consequences of his actions. The videos, the statements, and the public response were undeniable evidence of the mistake he had made. For the first time, he began to reflect on his own biases, recognizing that assumptions based on race or appearance could have serious, life-altering consequences. By the afternoon, community discussions were well underway. Meetings in city halls, schools, and local community centers addressed issues of trust, equality, and accountability. The mayor's leadership style became a focal point. His ability to remain calm, assert dignity, and demand accountability without escalating tension inspired many. Citizens began to see that courage was not always about confrontation. Sometimes it was about composure, clarity, and the ability to stand firm in the face of injustice. And so, the city moved forward, carrying with it the memory of that moment on the street. It was a reminder of vulnerability, power, and human dignity. It was a lesson in how a single event, witnessed by many, could spark reflection, dialogue, and change. The mayor's calm and firm response had transformed what could have been only a story of violence into a story of leadership, humanity, and accountability. The next morning, the city was still buzzing with talk about the previous day's incident. Everywhere people went, someone was mentioning the punch, the officer, and of course the mayor's calm response. In coffee shops, stores, and buses, conversations bounced from one group to another, each person sharing what they had seen or heard. The videos circulating online had turned the event into something larger than just one street corner. It had become a reflection of the city's deeper challenges, and many people felt it was their responsibility to speak up. The mayor, meanwhile, prepared for a day filled with meetings, press briefings, and calls from concerned citizens. He had slept only a few hours but remained composed, knowing that his role as a leader was now even more critical. The punch he had received was still slightly sore on his shoulder, but physical pain was minor compared to the responsibility he felt toward the people who had witnessed the event. He wanted to ensure that the story didn't get twisted, that the focus stayed on accountability, fairness, and systemic improvement rather than just anger or revenge. At the police station, the officer sat quietly in a small, stark room, waiting to be questioned further. His mind was racing, revisiting the events over and over again. He could feel the eyes of the public on him even when he was alone. The video evidence, now spread across social media and news outlets, made it impossible for him to ignore the reality. He had made a grave mistake. Not just a small error, but one that had consequences far beyond himself. He understood finally that authority without respect could quickly turn into disgrace, and his actions had shown exactly what happens when judgment is clouded by prejudice. When the officer was called into the questioning room, he saw his superior officers reviewing the videos and witness statements. They were calm but serious, their expressions unreadable. "Explain what happened," one of them asked in a tone that left no room for evasion. The officer swallowed hard and began recounting the events, but his words were shaky. He tried to justify his behavior, claiming suspicion and protocol, but the truth of what he had done was undeniable. He knew it, his superiors knew it, and deep down the officer knew that he would have to face the consequences. Meanwhile, the mayor met with a small group of advisors in his office. They discussed the growing attention from the media, the statements to be released, and the meetings planned with community leaders. "We need to focus on what matters," the mayor said firmly. "This is not about anger. It's about change. We cannot let one bad incident define the city, but we also cannot ignore it. People are looking for guidance, and we must show them that justice is possible." His words were calm, yet they carried a strength that inspired confidence in everyone around him. Later that day, the mayor decided to hold a public address. The city square, where many had gathered the day before, was now filled with citizens curious and eager to hear from their leader directly. Cameras, phones, and microphones surrounded him, but he remained unfazed. He understood that this moment was more than a statement. It was a demonstration of leadership in action. "I know many of you witnessed what happened yesterday," the mayor began, his voice steady. "It was wrong. There is no excuse for violence, and there is no place for prejudice in our city. We must hold ourselves accountable, and we must hold those in positions of authority accountable as well." His words carried clarity, focusing on justice and fairness without descending into anger or blame. The people listened intently, some nodding, some recording every word, and many feeling a sense of relief that their leader was addressing the issue with dignity. The mayor continued, describing how the city would move forward. Meetings would be held with law enforcement officials to review practices, ensure proper training, and address systemic issues. Community forums would be scheduled to allow citizens to voice concerns and share experiences. The goal was not only to address the incident itself, but to prevent similar mistakes in the future. People left the square feeling heard and understood, inspired to be part of a change that mattered. Meanwhile, the officer was placed on suspension while the investigation continued. The reality of public scrutiny was intense. Friends and colleagues looked at him differently. Social media posts criticized his actions, and the public demanded answers. For the first time, he was forced to confront his own biases honestly. He began to understand that assumptions based on appearance, race, or personal prejudice could lead to irreversible consequences. This realization was uncomfortable, painful, and humbling, but it was necessary for him to begin reflecting on his behavior. The videos from the incident continued to circulate, not as entertainment but as a reminder of accountability. News outlets interviewed witnesses, community leaders, and even experts on law enforcement and ethics. Discussions about racism, authority, and public trust were taking center stage. Citizens engaged in conversations at home, at work, and in community spaces. The story had sparked reflection and debate, and the mayor's calm handling of the situation served as a model for leadership that prioritized dignity and responsibility over anger or revenge. Throughout the day, the mayor met with several community leaders, including representatives from civil rights groups, neighborhood associations, and youth organizations. They discussed ways to strengthen trust between the community and law enforcement, focusing on communication, education, and fairness. The mayor listened carefully, took notes, and asked thoughtful questions, demonstrating that leadership was not just about making decisions, but about actively engaging with the people he served. The discussions were intense at times, but the tone remained constructive. There was a shared recognition that mistakes had been made, but there was also hope that they could lead to real improvement. At the precinct, the officer met with a counselor as part of the review process. They spoke about his reaction, the underlying biases that may have influenced his behavior, and how he could learn from the incident. It was a difficult conversation. He had to admit to himself what he had done wrong and face the reality of how deeply his actions had affected not just the mayor, but the community as a whole. The process was uncomfortable, but necessary for him to understand accountability and empathy in a way he had not before. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens continued to play an important role. Some visited City Hall to leave letters or messages expressing their support for fairness and justice. Others shared their own stories of encounters with authority, reflecting on how small acts of prejudice could escalate into harm. The mayor made it a point to acknowledge these voices, showing that leadership included listening as much as speaking. Every conversation, every meeting, and every message reinforced the idea that justice was not only about punishment, it was about understanding, reform, and community trust. By the end of the day, the city had shifted slightly. Streets seemed calmer, but the memory of the incident remained vivid in everyone's mind. People talked about what they had seen, what it meant for the city, and what they hoped would happen next. The mayor returned to his office, exhausted but resolute. He knew the incident would continue to spark discussion, but he also knew that it had opened an opportunity for meaningful change. He reflected on the importance of calmness, dignity, and measured action, realizing that these qualities could transform even a moment of injustice into a lesson for the entire city. That evening, as the city lights flickered on and the streets grew quieter, the officer sat alone in his home reflecting deeply. He replayed the events over and over, not to justify them but to understand the depth of his mistake. The realization that one wrong action could affect so many people weighed heavily on him. He began to see how important it was to confront personal biases and understand the human impact of every decision, especially when wearing a badge and representing authority. Across the city, citizens continued to share stories, engage in discussions, and reflect on what they had witnessed. The mayor's words and calm example had given people a sense of hope. That change was possible, that accountability was meaningful, and that one person's actions, when guided by dignity and responsibility, could inspire others to do the same. The incident, though shocking, became a catalyst for reflection, dialogue, and ultimately, a stronger connection between the people and their leaders. By the time the night fell, the city had absorbed the lessons of the day. The incident on the street, once a moment of fear and confusion, had evolved into a symbol of leadership, responsibility, and human dignity. People who had witnessed it carried the memory with them, sharing it with friends and family, reflecting on the importance of fairness, and considering how they could contribute to a community where respect and justice were central. And so, Part 3 closes with the city still in motion, but with a newfound sense of awareness. The officer faced consequences and reflection. The mayor had demonstrated the power of calm leadership, and the citizens had become active participants in a story that would shape the city's understanding of justice for years to come. The city was still alive with conversation and energy, but the focus had shifted. People weren't just talking about the punch anymore, they were talking about consequences. The incident had become a catalyst for accountability. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next, both to the officer and within the police department. Citizens were no longer passive observers. They were demanding fairness, justice, and tangible action. At City Hall, the mayor convened a meeting with his closest advisors and representatives from civil rights organizations. The room buzzed with concern but also with purpose. "We cannot let this incident fade away without action," the mayor said. "It is a chance to show that our city stands for justice, equality, and accountability. We have to make this clear, not just in words but in actions." His tone was calm but firm, commanding attention without raising his voice. Everyone in the room felt the weight of responsibility, understanding that this was a pivotal moment. Meanwhile, the officer was still under suspension. He had been informed that an internal investigation had begun and that his actions were being carefully reviewed by superiors. Video footage, witness statements, and public opinion were all part of the process, leaving no room for oversight. He sat alone in a small room at the precinct, replaying the events repeatedly in his mind. The reality was harsh. His career, his reputation, and the trust of the community were all at stake. For the first time, he confronted the seriousness of his actions without trying to minimize them. In the neighborhoods across the city, discussions about the incident continued to grow. Local community centers and neighborhood groups held meetings to talk about police conduct, racial equality, and civic responsibility. Ordinary citizens shared their own stories of unfair treatment, drawing connections between the incident and broader issues of systemic bias. Young people in particular were vocal, expressing frustration at the idea that prejudice could influence authority and potentially harm anyone at any time. These conversations were intense but constructive, driven by the shared goal of preventing similar incidents in the future. The mayor, aware of the heightened attention, decided to address the public formally. He stood on a podium in the city square, surrounded by cameras and microphones. The square was filled with people eager to hear him speak, their faces showing a mix of concern, anticipation, and hope. He began by acknowledging the incident directly, without deflecting responsibility or minimizing the impact. "Yesterday's event was unacceptable," he said, his voice steady and clear. "It was an act that should never have happened. We have already taken steps to investigate it fully and ensure that those responsible are held accountable. But this is also an opportunity for all of us to reflect on how we treat each other and how we ensure fairness and respect in every part of our city." The crowd listened attentively, some nodding, others holding phones to record every word. He spoke not only about the specific incident but also about the larger implications. "Justice is not just about punishment," he explained. "It is about understanding, reform, and creating a system that prevents mistakes from happening again. Every person who lives in this city deserves to feel safe and respected, and every person in a position of authority must act with integrity and fairness at all times." His words resonated, inspiring a sense of hope and purpose among those gathered. As the day continued, the police department announced that the officer would face formal disciplinary action. The news spread quickly, reinforcing the sense that accountability mattered. Social media, news outlets, and local forums were filled with discussions about what steps the department should take to prevent such incidents in the future. Many people emphasized the importance of training, education, and sensitivity in law enforcement, while others highlighted the broader issue of racial bias and the need for systemic reform. The officer, now fully aware of the gravity of his actions, began to reflect deeply. He met with a counselor as part of the investigation process, discussing not only the incident but also the biases and assumptions that had led to it. It was an uncomfortable process, forcing him to confront long-held beliefs and examine how his actions had affected not only the mayor, but also the community as a whole. He realized that authority without understanding and empathy could cause real harm, and that learning from mistakes was the first step toward true accountability. Meanwhile, the mayor focused on constructive solutions. He initiated meetings with community leaders, police officials, and citizens to discuss reforms that could prevent similar situations in the future. These discussions included ideas for better training programs, clear protocols for accountability, and avenues for citizens to report concerns safely. The goal was not only to address the immediate incident, but to strengthen trust between the community and law enforcement. Every conversation emphasized collaboration, understanding, and shared responsibility. By the afternoon, public reaction had reached a peak. News outlets interviewed witnesses, experts, and community leaders. People discussed not only the mayor's response but also the officer's actions, the importance of accountability, and the broader societal implications. Citizens debated the proper balance between authority and responsibility, and the incident became a case study in how individual actions can have far-reaching consequences. Conversations took place in offices, homes, schools, and public spaces, showing that this was no longer just a local news story. It had become a topic of civic reflection. At City Hall, the mayor met with a group of young leaders from local organizations. They shared their experiences and frustrations, discussing times when they felt marginalized or unfairly treated. The mayor listened attentively, taking notes and asking questions. He wanted to ensure that policies and reforms reflected the real experiences of the people he served. His approach was patient and thoughtful, emphasizing empathy as much as authority. The young leaders left feeling heard, motivated, and more confident that their voices could influence real change. As evening approached, the mayor released a formal statement to the public. It was carefully worded, emphasizing accountability, reflection, and community engagement. This incident should serve as a reminder that every action matters, he wrote. We are committed to ensuring that justice is served, that authority is exercised responsibly, and that every citizen is treated with dignity and respect. Together, we can build a community where fairness and understanding guide our actions, and where mistakes are addressed openly and constructively. The statement was widely shared, further reinforcing the message of responsibility and reform. Meanwhile, the officer faced additional scrutiny from colleagues, family, and the wider community. The consequences of his actions became clear. He was suspended, subjected to training programs, and required to reflect deeply on his behavior. The process was challenging, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about prejudice, authority, and the impact of a single decision. Yet it also became an opportunity for personal growth, as he began to understand the importance of empathy, accountability, and fairness in both his professional and personal life. Across the city, ordinary citizens continued to engage with the issue. Meetings were held in schools, neighborhood centers, and community organizations to discuss racial equality, public safety, and responsible authority. People shared stories, proposed solutions, and discussed ways to create a stronger, more equitable community. The mayor's leadership style became a focal point. His calm, thoughtful approach inspired citizens to reflect not only on the incident itself, but also on how they could contribute to a more just society. By nightfall, the city had absorbed the lessons of the day. The incident had sparked reflection, dialogue, and action. Citizens felt empowered to speak up. The officer faced necessary consequences, and the mayor had demonstrated the power of calm, measured leadership. The city had witnessed the importance of accountability, the impact of prejudice, and the potential for meaningful change when leaders and citizens worked together. As people returned to their homes, conversations continued in living rooms, kitchens, and online forums. Families discussed fairness, respect, and the responsibilities that come with authority. Friends debated how to address bias in their own lives and communities. Students wrote reflections in classrooms, exploring what it meant to act with integrity and empathy. The incident, once shocking and frightening, had transformed into a lesson that extended far beyond the original street corner. The mayor ended the day exhausted but determined. He reflected on how quickly one moment could influence the city, how a single act of aggression could ignite discussion, reflection, and change. He also recognized that leadership required patience, clarity, and dignity, especially when faced with wrongdoing. His focus remained on progress, ensuring that the city learned from the incident and that citizens felt safe, respected, and empowered. Even the officer, after a long day of reflection and meetings with counselors, began to understand the depth of his mistake. He recognized that the consequences were not only professional but personal, and that learning from this experience was essential. He realized that authority came with responsibility and that respect, fairness, and empathy were not optional. They were fundamental to his role and to the trust placed in him by the community. By the end of Part 4, the city had moved beyond shock and anger. It had entered a stage of reflection, accountability, and constructive action. The mayor's leadership, the officer's realization, and the community's engagement combined to create a turning point. The story was no longer just about a punch or a single moment of prejudice. It had become a symbol of responsibility, dignity, and the power of human-centered leadership. Days passed, but the city was still alive with the memory of the incident. The story of the punch and the mayor's calm response had traveled far beyond the street where it happened. People talked about it on buses, in coffee shops, in workplaces, and at schools. The incident had become more than news. It had become a conversation about respect, fairness, and leadership. Citizens continued to reflect on how a moment of anger could affect so many lives, and how dignity and composure could turn an unfair situation into a lesson for everyone. The mayor, despite the whirlwind of media attention and meetings, continued to focus on the work that truly mattered. He spent his mornings visiting community centers, schools, and neighborhood meetings. He wanted to see firsthand how people were feeling after the incident, to hear their concerns and to understand their needs. His approach was simple: listen more than speak, acknowledge pain, and create solutions together. People appreciated this hands-on leadership, noticing that he cared about real experiences, not just headlines. The officer, on the other hand, was experiencing a very different reality. His suspension was still in effect, and the internal review continued. He had been required to attend meetings with supervisors, counselors, and mentors focused on understanding bias, empathy, and accountability. At first, he had resisted these discussions, feeling defensive and frustrated. But slowly, through repeated reflection, he began to see his mistake from a different perspective. He realized that his actions had not only hurt the mayor, but had shaken the community's trust in law enforcement. It was a sobering, humbling realization, but it was necessary. The mayor decided that the city needed more than temporary measures. He organized a series of public forums inviting citizens, police officials, and community leaders to discuss reforms and improvements. Each session was structured to encourage honest dialogue, where people could speak freely about their experiences and frustrations, and where solutions could be brainstormed collaboratively. These meetings became a space for trust building, showing that leadership meant addressing issues openly, rather than avoiding difficult conversations. At one of these forums, the mayor spoke directly to the community. Yesterday, last week, last month, anytime someone in a position of authority abuses their power, it affects all of us, he said. It is not just about one person or one moment. It is about ensuring that we live in a city where every person feels safe, respected, and heard. We must work together to prevent injustice, to hold people accountable, and to build understanding in our community. His words were simple, but their impact was profound. People left these meetings feeling empowered, knowing that their voices mattered and that the mayor truly listened. Meanwhile, the officer began his own journey of accountability. He was required to participate in workshops and training focused on recognizing bias and building empathy. At first, it was uncomfortable. He had to admit truths about himself that he had never faced before. But over time, he started to understand how his assumptions had shaped his behavior and how much harm one impulsive action could cause. The experience did not excuse his behavior, but it allowed him to reflect, learn, and begin to change. He realized that true accountability went beyond punishment. It required deep understanding and personal growth. Social media continued to play a role in the city's reflection. Videos, news stories, and commentary were shared widely, but the focus shifted from anger and outrage to discussion and learning. Citizens debated ways to improve relationships between law enforcement and the community, highlighted examples of positive leadership, and emphasized that dignity and fairness should guide every interaction. The mayor's calm response became a model for people to follow, showing that leadership was not just about authority, but about empathy, courage, and the ability to turn a negative moment into an opportunity for education and growth. In his office, the mayor worked on long-term reforms. He met with legal advisors, policy experts, and community representatives to develop programs aimed at improving police accountability, public trust, and bias training. These initiatives were designed to create lasting impact, ensuring that the city did not just react to a single incident, but learned from it in a meaningful way. The mayor understood that change required consistent effort, not just immediate action, and he was determined to make these improvements permanent. The city's citizens noticed the efforts. Community groups reported that meetings were productive, neighborhoods felt safer discussing concerns, and people who had witnessed or experienced unfair treatment felt more supported. The mayor's consistent engagement reinforced the idea that leadership required visibility, responsiveness, and integrity. It also reminded people that change was possible when leaders acted with empathy and accountability. The officer, too, began to see small shifts in his own understanding. He realized that being part of the police force was not only about enforcing laws, but about protecting and respecting all members of the community. He recognized that trust had to be earned and maintained, not assumed. Though the incident would always remain a part of his record, it became a turning point, a moment where he could choose to learn, grow, and rebuild. Meanwhile, the mayor continued to visit schools and community centers, speaking with students about respect, responsibility, and leadership. He shared lessons from the incident, not to dwell on negativity, but to inspire young people to think critically about fairness, empathy, and justice. Students responded positively, asking thoughtful questions and sharing their own experiences. They left feeling empowered, seeing leadership as something that involved courage, dignity, and responsibility, not just authority or power. Across the city, conversations began to change. People who had been angry or upset now discussed solutions, reflecting on how the community could prevent similar incidents. Parents spoke to children about fairness and respect, co-workers debated policies and accountability measures, and students explored ethical leadership in classrooms. The story of the mayor and the officer had become a lesson in civics, empathy, and human dignity. By the end of the week, the officer had completed a significant portion of his training and reflection sessions. He met with supervisors to discuss what he had learned, acknowledging the mistakes he had made and expressing a willingness to improve. Though the process was difficult, it marked a step toward rebuilding trust both personally and within the department. He understood that he could not erase what had happened, but he could work to ensure that such a mistake would never happen again. The mayor, meanwhile, continued his work tirelessly. He drafted policies, spoke with citizens, and monitored the progress of reforms. His efforts were not about publicity. They were about real, measurable change. He understood that leadership meant taking responsibility not only for himself, but for the systems around him. His calm response, consistent engagement, and focus on solutions had turned a shocking incident into a story of hope, accountability, and resilience. As weeks passed, the city began to feel a renewed sense of unity. Citizens noticed the changes in community engagement. Discussions about bias and fairness became more common, and the police department implemented stronger accountability measures. People felt safer speaking up, knowing that their voices mattered and that leadership could act decisively while still being fair and empathetic. The story of the punch and the mayor's response had left a lasting mark on the city's collective memory. One evening, as the sun set over the city, the mayor walked through a neighborhood park. Children played on the swings, parents watched from benches, and neighbors greeted each other warmly. He observed the scene with quiet satisfaction. The city had faced a difficult moment, but it had emerged stronger. The incident had sparked conversations, reflection, and action. It had shown that even in moments of anger and injustice, dignity and leadership could guide the way toward progress. At the same time, the officer reflected quietly on his own journey. He had made a mistake that could have ruined his career, but it had also forced him to confront his own biases and assumptions. He began to see his role not just as enforcing rules, but as serving and protecting a community that deserved respect. The experience had changed him, teaching lessons about empathy, accountability, and the real meaning of authority. The city, its leaders, and its citizens had all learned something valuable. Leadership was about more than power. It was about integrity, dignity, and responsibility. Mistakes could happen, but how people responded to them mattered most. Accountability, reflection, and constructive action could turn moments of injustice into opportunities for growth. Citizens realized the importance of speaking up, engaging and holding leaders accountable, while leaders recognized that empathy and fairness were essential for trust and progress. In the months that followed, the city continued to thrive. Reforms in policing, community engagement, and education took root. The mayor maintained his hands-on approach, ensuring that policies,